Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So thanks for coming to the better Superman movie tonight. I guess we'll get started here with the ending. We were just talking about it.
Yeah. First, how many of you have read the book? We saw how many had. Okay, so not a whole lot of people. One of the things that's rather controversial about the film is that the ending is quite different from the book. And many people who have read the book, including Sean, you heard he read it just recently, find it one of the most amazing endings of any Henry James novel. And it does, Verena does go off with Basil Ransom, but she says, now I am glad, said Verena, when they reached the street. But though she was glad, he, Basil, presently discovered that beneath her hood she was in tears. It is to be feared that with the union, so far from brilliant, into which she was about to enter, these were not the last she was destined to shed. But there's another change in the ending, which is that you see Olive Chancellor taking the podium. And in the novel, she does that, but nobody's listening. They're still drifting off. In the film, she gets to give her great feminist speech, and people sit and applaud. And so I think that was another way in which the filmmakers were trying to keep the feminist theme going and not let it all dwindle away into this heterosexual union.
Well, you notice she gets the war drums that usually accompany Christopher Reeve whenever he walks in.
But I think one of the great things about the film is how much is in the film that's also in the book. And I noticed a lot of you were laughing at laugh lines. Those were Henry James's laugh lines quite often in the book. There's a lot of dialogue from the book. And then what's expanded on is often quite interesting, historical research from the time, so that when Verena Tarrant is giving her great speech in the Burges family in New York City, she's a lot of what she says is taken from Margaret Fuller's Woman in the 19th Century. That's probably familiar to some of you. She says, "Let them be sea captains." That's Margaret Fuller's great line. And in the Athenaeum, I think you probably enjoyed the Athenaeum scenes, those of you who know the Athenaeum. Miss Birdseye picks out Margaret Fuller's book to hand to Basil Ransom, Woman in the 19th Century. So there's a lot. I think they went into this with a great deal of seriousness. And even though it's maybe a lighter version than, in some ways, than the book.
Yeah, now, the Mrs. Birdseye was supposed to be Alice Peabody, right?
Miss Birdseye, you have to say.
Mrs., yeah. Silly me.
So some of you may have followed or read a fair amount about Henry James and his life. This book was written, the James family spent much time in Europe, but also some time in Boston and Cambridge. I think he was born in New York City. And his father, Henry James Sr., he was the mere junior, Henry James Jr., was part of the Transcendentalist group, and amongst those people were some of the people I've written about, and in particular, Elizabeth Peabody, the oldest of the three Peabody sisters, who had a long life in reform movements, was thought to have been parodied in this book. And William James, who was still in the U.S., Henry's older brother, a professor at Harvard, wrote to his brother Henry, saying, had gone back to England. I think he wrote it while there. How could you have done this to our Miss Peabody, who was then still alive? And the people were up in arms about that. And if you read the book, you'll see that Miss Birdseye is often described in ways that that Elizabeth Peabody would have been. But Henry James always disputed this. He said, no, that's not right. And in fact added some things that might distract people, that she had gone to the South and delivered Bibles to the enslaved population there, which I don't think any white woman I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, would have been able to do at the time.
I don't feel like that was allowed.
So anyway, so he's dressed that up a little bit, but the accusation that this may have been a send-up of Elizabeth Peabody, and if there's I forget now which kind of bird it is that says Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. That's some kind of so there's definitely a way in which the name might have been drawn from Miss Peabody. But in the film, all these kind of ancillary characters are so vivid and they're so well acted. With Jessica Tandy as Miss Peabody, she has a lot of dignity, I think, as they do in the book. And this is the wonderful thing about both the book and the movie is that, it's complicated. And sometimes you hate Basil Ransom, sometimes you think he's kind of hunky and nice and maybe, has a point. And these, so Dr. Prance, there were a number of prominent women doctors, Harriet Hunt, Mary Putnam Jacoby, who founded a hospital for women. She's very much drawing on actual people. And I even think that the wretched father of Verena Tarrant, the Mr. Seance guy, it has something in common with Bronson Alcott. And his harebrained schemes, the utopian communities and all of that, and I think you even maybe see that in the character on screen. You were going to say, or one of us can say a little bit about why was this film made? Why the Bostonians? I mean, the Merchant and Ivory had done the Europeans, I think, previously, but The Bostonians is not one of the better known novels of Henry James, not one of the best known, although it's the favorite of some people here, I know. But do you want to tell what you learned about this story?
Yeah, it was originally a 4-part series for PBS, and it was going to be, I believe, documentaries about Henry James. Is that correct?
Henry, William, and Alice.
And then the 4th chapter was going to be an adaptation of the Bostonians. And it was a GBH project, and the President Reagan cut the funding. What kind of jerk president cuts the funding for public broadcasting? So they decided they had the script and said, well, let's just get the financing and do it as an independent film.
So I remember seeing this when it came out, 1984. And then a couple of years later, exactly 1 year later, I had signed a contract for the biography of the Peabody sisters that then took me 20 years to write. Came out in 2005. I was in England in, I think, 1987 on a NEH grant. NEH. To support the research. And I was staying in the home of Jock and Diana Murray, the publishers of Ruth Jabvala, and who were friends of my husband's family. And they said, oh, well, she's got to meet Ruth Jabvala, their author, who happened to be in London then. And so this was arranged. I had lunch with her at Harrods. I was, this was only the second time I'd even been in Europe, and I think that the idea was that maybe I could pitch her on a screenplay about the Peabody sisters, since that's what I was working on, and I was so intimidated and scared, but she was very nice to me, a woman of about my mother's age, and I can't really even remember what was said because I was so intimidated by her and so overawed by Harrods and London and all of that. But I can tell you that I did meet her, and she did not decide to make a film about the Peabody sisters. I think she'd had enough. My one other connection with the film directly, which I think some people here might understand the interest of this, I lived for a while in the South End some years after, I don't know, not so long after this. And I lived near a couple who ran a design business called Philidor Press. They did all the design work for the Rebels. And they had been asked to make the posters, the props in the film. So knowing that I was working on something adjacent, they gave me some spare posters. And if you remember in the film, you might remember towards the end, Basil Ransom is going about Boston tearing these posters. And those are the posters that Scott Kosofsky and Sue Lauder designed and printed for this film. And I still have one, and it's hanging in my office at Emerson College. Those are my 2 points of connection. So, Philidor Press.
So we have a question from the audience to talk about the scenes that were actually filmed in Boston and Cambridge. They recognize Beacon Hill, Harvard Yard, Memorial Hall. Was Olive Chancellor's house on Mount Auburn Street in Boston?
You mean, maybe they mean Mount Vernon Street. Yeah, I think it was, I think we were seeing Mount Vernon Street there. I've been doing a little research on the film. Apparently they felt it was really hard to find, which is surprising to me they would say that, but hard to find, whole blocks of old houses. And of course, Charles Street, in the book, she lives on Charles Street, which then in the 1870s, when this was meant to be set, I think many of those houses just stretched out to the Charles River. And not all of them are left, so they couldn't film on Charles Street to make it seem like a just sort of residential neighborhood. But it is, so Harvard Yard, this is very significant. Everybody knows Harvard doesn't let anybody film in Harvard Yard, but they let Merchant and Ivory film in Harvard Yard. And then I find, both in the book and in the movie, one of the most moving scenes is the one in Memorial Hall. And even Basil Ransom gets choked up there. And the music, there's something's being, it's Brahms' alto Rhapsody is being rehearsed with piano, not orchestra, probably in Sanders Theater. And they're walking amongst the names of the Union dead. And interestingly, the book says simply 1870s. For the movie, because I think they wanted to film this 4th of July scene, a centennial scene. So they say it begins 1875, and then 1876 is the last year. But Memorial Hall was brand new then, just barely in existence. I think it was first inhabited in 1875 and 76. So it's very moving. We can't quite see how shiny that space might have been, the marble. In 1875 or 6, but it is at least within the realm of possibility that year could have been the year.
It's quite the move to bring your Confederate soldier suitor to a Civil War memorial. I mean, if you want to talk about first dates, that's a scary one.
Right. And then to dress him down when he says, I wish I could, I should have been here. Well, I couldn't be here, she says back to him. But I think there's a way, I was reading the novel again before tonight, and even more in the novel, but it's also there in the movie, this sense that this is a novel about the Reconstruction era. There are no black people in it. The abolition is kind of replaced by the women's movement. We do get this comparison of that women are as slaves and they need to be freed. But I think there's a real, in both of them, tangling with this unsettled, unresolved war that was a victory but not a victory, as we're experiencing today. Hasn't really been solved. We've got a president who's renaming the army bases for Confederate generals. So there's a lot involved in this, really kind of a tragedy of a film and of a book. I think if you're on the Union side, if you're on the women's side, when she goes off with the handsome Southerner and is silenced.
Well, that sort of leads into the next question here, because they want to know what we think of the acting. And particularly, I think Christopher Reeve, he never really got a career outside of Superman. But he did get to play a Southerner in this and a Nazi in The Remains of the Day. So Merchant Ivory really played with that.
Yeah.
But he's really charming in this. You kind of, I mean, I know we're supposed to hate Basil, but you're kind of rooting for him because Redgrave's a little drip sometimes. Would you want to hang out with this clingy old lady?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the question probably refers to the acting overall. Didn't Vanessa Redgrave get an Oscar nomination for this?
She should have.
I think
I'm
she
terrible
did.
at Oscar trivia.
But, there's also a school of thought that she's a little overacting, and it's this kind of stereotypic view of the term old maid comes up in the film, but it is a star turn. And I was also really impressed with Madeleine Potter as Verena. I think she brings a lot of complexity to the role, and so those are the three principals. And then everyone else is so excellent. Wally Shawn, we're laughing every time he says anything, and partly it's him, but it's partly the script. Again, I think Ruth Jabala is really very, very gifted.
I ran into Wallace Shawn at the movies in New York last year, and I can't figure out how he's been the same age for my entire life.
Yeah.
Exactly the same.
And, I think it was... the relationship of Verena and Olive is a very powerful, and it's a love relationship. And it's a little ambiguous in the book, a little ambiguous in the movie, but this is 1984. And I was thinking about this around the same time. One of my other biographies is of Elizabeth Bishop, and the first sort of standard biography of Elizabeth Bishop was by Brett Millier, worked on during the 80s, published I think around 1990. And in that book, she, Elizabeth Bishop had a number of deep, powerful love relationships with women, and yet in that biography published in 1990, this writer felt she had to kind of dance around that and not really speak all that openly about it. So I think, this was maybe... I don't think it's. We can't really judge it by the standards of now, I guess, is what I'm saying. I think there's some real love shown there, and it's a love triangle in which all parts are equal.
Yeah, there's a question from the audience asking if we really thought it was ambiguous because it seems strongly homoerotic, and they seem to cut away a lot. Like as soon as they start kind of touching each other, it just cuts to the next scene. Remember, this was 84. It was right before the new queer cinema. And so in Merchant Ivory, there's a tradition in their films. Everything's about this repressed longing. All their films are sort of love that dares not speak its name. And I don't know if you've guys seen the documentary about Merchant Ivory that came out last year. Those cats were wild. It was like Fleetwood Mac. Like they were a couple. Everyone was... They had a lot going on in that whole organization.
Well, and including with, I think one of the other great aspects of pretty much all these films, Merchant Ivory films, is the music. Richard Robbins was apparently quite involved with these men, and he did some composition work, but selected these great the Brahms, and there's the overture to Lohengrin you hear at the beginning and at the end. The wonderful work with the organ and the stops. I mean, music is very, and Annabelle Lee, all these songs that come through. I think that really is a signature quality of these films, is just how, I don't know, you can kind of, the music is always right, I think.
So another thing we should bring up for the scenes shot at the Athenaeum, they'd originally gotten permission, then I don't know if you folks remember, Vanessa Redgrave was rather outspoken about certain issues and had gotten in a little trouble. And so they rescinded the permission, and then they decided it was okay to shoot there as long as she wasn't in the scenes.
Mm-hmm. But she was in the scenes. I read the same thing. She was in one interior scene. Maybe they just didn't want her out in front.
Yeah.
I'm guessing what that was. But if you think about also the front of the Athenaeum as shown there has some trees in front of it, which well, they have now replanted some trees in front of the Athenaeum, I think, but for quite a while it was just this barren space, and I liked seeing that again. I puzzled a little bit about the Charles River and the rowers. It seemed a little narrow to me, but again, you know, we don't really know what the Charles River looked like in the 1870s. I don't, but I guess that could be found out.
It might have been in upstate New York. A lot of this was shot in Troy.
We have questions. Do you know how to? There are questions you can put through somehow on your phone, but there's also a hand in the audience. I don't know. Yes, farther up, right. So
yeah, a little bit about the casting. So they had actually asked Vanessa Redgrave first, and she turned the role down. So then it was going to be Julie Christie, and then she went off to do something else. So then they cast Glenn Close, and she was cast in it, but she ran over schedule on The Natural.
Oh.
And I guess she would rather be Robert Redford's girlfriend than, and so they went back, and Redgrave suddenly changed her mind and decided she would be in it, maybe because she'd gotten into trouble. I don't know. And meanwhile, there was this student fresh out of BU who was begging for an audition to play Verena, and she couldn't get one, and that was Julianne Moore.
Well, that brings up another point that's somewhat different between the book and the film, which is in the book, Verena and Olive are always referred to as young girls. And it's clear that Olive is a little bit older, but maybe not that much older. And, you know, she has this sister who was married. That's not necessarily a younger sister. It could be the older sister, you know, Mrs. Luna, who's also chasing after Basil Ransom. So I also wonder whether, I don't know. I mean, again, it's maybe this bit of a stereotypical relationship that we're seeing up there. But had they had Julianne Moore, who would have been closer in age to Madeleine Potter, it would have been a hotter romance, I think, and the loss would have been greater or more different, you know, different. So I think that's a little something to think about.
And someone wants to know if Christopher Reeve was the first choice. I'm not sure. I think so, because in order to get financing for something like this, you needed stars. And, you know, you always felt bad for the Juilliard-trained guy who was trying to do something where he couldn't wear tights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you notice Mrs. Burrage was Livia Soprano?
Ooh.
Much different relationship with her son than we're used to seeing.
Speaking of which, I saw Christopher Reeve on stage in Boston in a play with Katharine Hepburn before he was anything at
really?
all. And I can't remember now the name of the play. And I went because a college friend's friend was... Oh, right. Thank you. Thank you, Lloyd. Did you see it as well? You didn't? I did. All right. We saw him. Katharine Hepburn, Christopher Reeve, and Danny Tam, the high school friend of my Bennington boyfriend from New Jersey. That's why I went, because Danny invited us. Anyway, Danny Tam didn't go too far.
Yeah, local trivia. This movie was the highest grossing film at the Copley Place Cinema.
Oh.
I don't know if you guys remember, that was the worst place to see a movie. It's the only theater I've ever been where it goes backwards, so the seats in the back are behind the ones in the front.
Right, I remember that. That
it had
was
all
terrible.
the critic screenings there, in case you wonder why we give movies bad reviews. So we got an audience member question coming in.
I was going to, unless you have a question, there was...
Fire away.
I was going to just read one, it's even just a half sentence, but for those who haven't read the book, there's just some great writing about being in and around Boston. And when Basil comes back to Boston to try to find Verena in Cambridge, and he runs into Miss Birdseye. At first, it's quite cold, and you know everything seems bleak. But when it turns out that maybe she's going to tell him how he can find Verena, the atmosphere lifts, and it's suddenly Henry James writes, it was as if the touch of the air itself were gloved. I just love that. So the air has its gloves on to caress you in in a warming winter day.
That's not my experience of Boston winters. So, do we think the film says something specific about Boston and about class
That's a good
in
question.
particular?
Well, the Bostonians, until actually my most recent reading of this book, I assumed it was kind of talking about all of Boston, what Bostonians are like. But I think people have read even more of Henry James than I have, which is not a whole lot. You understand that these titles usually refer to specific people, the Europeans or the American. So the Bostonians really are just Verena and Olive, and they're first referred to as the Bostonians when they're in New York to give that talk. So, and then it comes up a number of times when they're not in Boston. They're the Bostonians. But what does it say about Boston? I mean, I think Henry James was to some extent parodying the inclinations towards reform of Boston, but he also had a lot of respect for it. I think of him as a lot like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote a sort of similar book called The Blithedale Romance about his time spent at Brook Farm. And similarly, there's a charismatic feminist heroine who is a great speaker, and then there's a sweet younger woman who's under her spell, that kind of thing. And reform really is the enemy in that book. So, these are New Englanders who are looking askance at the New England that bred them, looking askance in Henry James' case at his father probably, and the Transcendentalists. But I think, Bostonians, I think, sometimes don't mind having fun poked at them if it's by a great writer. So maybe that's a kind of Bostonian thing about it too. We can laugh at ourselves. We can laugh at our causes, even as we are never going to give them up. I think Bostonians are more like Olive. I identify a lot with Olive, and I don't know, Verena doesn't seem very Bostonian to me.
Well, it's funny how much the perception of Bostonians has shifted since the book was written and now.
That's true.
Not a single Red Sox hat in this movie.
No.
Not one Dunkin' Donuts. So it's a question for Megan. When you quoted the last line of the novel, and the tears would not be the last you would shed in the Union, do you think that's also a reference to the Civil War and the tears that will be shed in the country?
I was thinking about that Union, the word Union, as I was reading that, and of course there's I don't think the book is saying this is going to work out, by any means. And that's a good point about the Union. There's also, though it reminds me of another passage in Margaret Fuller's The Woman in the 19th Century, that before we can have unions, we have to be units. So that's another bit of wisdom for all of you out there having marriages of whatever sort you have.
So here's one more for Megan. I know you just wrote a memoir, but what will be your next biography? They don't want to hear about you.
Well, I did sort of say at the end of that book that I would write biographically again and end the memoir trend. I'm thinking of writing a book that would be a set of biographical essays about interesting people who are buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery, where I walk quite a lot. So, and they would not be the obvious Longfellow and Mary Baker Eddy folks. They'd be somebody a little bit more off the beaten path.
Well, thank you very much for coming out. Thank all of you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.